Hello everyone, thanks for downloading this video. Wanted to take the opportunity of sharing with you a presentation we gave at White Pine Council Stewards Con. The title is Not More Civic Broccoli, which I know has an interesting ring to it, but we're going to be sharing more about what does that mean as we go forward for about the next 20 to 25 minutes. So what I'd like to share with you is an overview of the future of Scouting, but we're going to spend a little bit of time giving you a bit of background as to some of the fundamentals of how do we get here over the past 100 years. We're going to take the opportunity to think about what is the reflection or perceptions of Scouting currently, and what are some of the views, some of the things we need to take into consideration around the strategic headwinds and tailwinds for the future, and what does that mean that we need to be thinking about doing differently, doing more of, and maybe doing some less of. So a little bit about myself and my Scouting background I wanted to share with you. So as you can see, there's a picture of me back as a Cub Scout in the UK more than enough years ago now. You can also see that coming from a Scouting family, my wife's a Scouter, my two boys are in Scouting, and actually this picture's a little bit dated now, but the older one has aged out of Venturers and the young one is going through his Venturer campaign as we speak. So it started about 10.5 years ago when I came to Canada. I had the opportunity to be colony, pack and company scouter. I'm still a company scouter to this day. I also had the opportunity to work at the council level, both as area commissioner, but also DCC and council commissioner. So hopefully I've really got that boots on the ground experience that I'm able to bring in to Scouting now as a full-time employee to really put the perspectives and the real values as well as the real challenges that we face on the ground day to day. As you can see, I had the opportunity to be on the chair, as a chair of the National Property Committee in my role on the board of directors. So something that was very interesting to me, and have been now working for Scouts Canada as the executive director since April of 2018. So what keeps me up at night? What are some of those challenges that when I look out in the world of Scouting and I think to myself, you know, what do we need to be really thinking about when we look at the relevancy of Scouting, and then indeed standing back and asking, you know, what have we done well which we should celebrate, and what do we need to be thinking about doing in the future? So here's a chart, as you can see, of the membership of Scouting over the last 100 years. It is fairly normal for most organizations across North America in its growth cycles, and I'm going to share a little bit more on that with you as we go forward. But in essence, we peaked at around 1960s following the baby boom which followed World War II, and had a rapid period of growth from about 1900 to 1910, not dissimilar to many other youth, community and social organizations. And then we've been in, candidly speaking, 50 years of decline since about the 1960s. We had a bump, as you can see from the orange in the chart, where beavers came in. But other than that, we have actually been challenged with steadying that decline. To some success in the last 10 years, it's flattened, and we should reflect upon what are some of those program elements that have been successful and what are some of the things that we've done which have been successful. But it really needs us to be reflecting upon, you know, what would be a realistic market share as we go forward, and how would we be building that? What is relevant, and perhaps what do we need to do differently? So that's really what we'll be talking about over the next 20 minutes. So here's some perceptions of Scouting. I think much of this imagery is fairly normal to most people, and they wouldn't be surprised by seeing some of these images, maybe with the exception of the dodo in the bottom right. Although, of course, that brings to mind a lot of what we hear, which is, does Scouting still exist? Many people believe that actually we became extinct quite some time ago. The other sorts of things that you hear on a common basis are positive elements around outdoors, camping, youth development, confidence building, independence. But we equally hear old-fashioned, religious, militaristic, non-diverse. Still we hear it's boys only, which of course it's not and hasn't been for quite some time. So we have to reflect upon that and think about how is our message getting out, how is our brand getting out, and what are we doing at the local levels and the national levels to support that. So fortunately, Robert Putnam put a book together back It's about 10, 20 years old now, but he reflected on the decline of civic engagement and social values across North America. And he used a variety of different data sources to be able to get was a local phenomena, or was this something which was more broad across, in his viewpoint, the whole of America? So I'm showing a chart here which kind of exemplifies the problem and the challenge that we've got. So this is the membership rate in 32 US-based chapter organizations, similar organizations to Scouts Canada. So the BSA data is included in this chart, as is 4-H, Rotary, Boys and Girls Clubs, Girl Guides, etc. And you might be able to tell already that there is this similar pattern that we're seeing in this data set, so reflecting all of those organizations, which is that rapid increase in membership from about 1900, 1910, peaking in 1960 and then dropping off, and has been in decline ever since. So one of the key takeaways that we immediately get from this, and I think it's really important for all of us when often we look at the Scouts Canada membership in isolation, is the underlying trends that we are seeing are the same as the majority of like-minded and other civic, social and community organizations in North America. Predominantly those that have a very large volunteer base and, if you like, a civic responsibility. So we're going to be coming back onto that. But I just want to share to you another couple of things to kind of really hammer the point home, which I find interesting. So the world has changed, and so we've talked a little bit about some of those stories. We looked at the 32 chapter-based organizations. The book Bowling Alone, which was Putnam's thesis that he put together, really built upon his observation of league bowling in the US. I mean, as you can see, so bowling, so 10-pin bowling as we know it, I mean, look at that exact same distribution curve that we're seeing, which exactly mirrors what we're seeing in Scouts Canada. And again, tailing off, and actually has gone into almost insignificance now up into the 2000s and into this century. So here is the Parent Teachers Association, so another kind of a key component of North American society. Again, that has had to dramatically adjust. One of the reasons why we're seeing a bounce in their organization into the 1990s, 2000, is they went from being a large organization trying to meet the needs of all different parent teachers across the entire country into looking at a differentiated model. So something for us to consider in terms of how we're differentiating and understanding the different segments. And here is the 32 chapter-based organizations that we started with. And now I put on top Scouts Canada membership, and you can see again, really to bring that home, the exact same trend that we're seeing Scouts Canada is being seen by largely all organizations across North America, except for a few, and we have to ask ourselves, what are those few doing differently, and what can we learn from that? So, of course, Putnam didn't stop at just looking at the observations and seeing that this was a common trend. He fundamentally asked the questions as why, what's changing, and that's of course useful to us, because if we can understand the why of the reasoning for growth and then decline, what does that tell us about going forward? So here's a couple of charts and a composition of some of the data that he has gathered. And you'll see everything from when people have worked in community projects, are people trusted? So it gives you a bit of a feel around how society reflected on, if you like, figures in society, whether that be politicians or universities or otherwise. You also see the trends that we've got relating to attendance at church, voting, politics, and even participation and membership of groups. And it's pretty easy to see that the underlying trends in all of these is negative, and these are working, of course, to go against the pattern of the peak in civic and social and community participation. The other themes that we haven't shown up here, but are kind of implicit in what we're showing, is conversely to the decline, is the increase in technology, and what that means in terms of creating more time in the home to be able to do other things, particularly the ability for people to take on dual incomes. And so you actually do see, inverse to these relationships, a significant increase in dual income families, i.e. mum and dad are at work, which implicitly explains why we suddenly have reduced the ability and the number of people available to volunteer and the amount of time for people to be able to contribute to civic engagement, communities, clubs, etc. So it's a very good read, and I strongly recommend if people are interested in getting Putnam's Bowling Alone. But he concludes with this statement, which I think is particularly powerful. What we need is not civic broccoli, which is good for you but unappealing, but instead an updated version of Scouting's ingenious combination of values and fun. So of course, you know, that has a lot of meaning to us within Scouting, but there's a couple of things which I think really resonate. When we look at many of the organizations that grew from the 1900s up to their peak, including Scouting, it was this civic broccoli. It was good for you. They didn't necessarily maintain that ability to, with adapting society, with adapting technology, with adapting volunteerism. How did they maintain that ability to provide something that society needed at the same time of generating value, providing impact, and also being fun at the same time? So Putnam kind of really proposes a solution for, in essence, we need more Scouting. That's certainly how I'm going to take away from that. But let's look at some of the key ingredients on a more serious note as to around what does it mean we have to think about what we're doing now and what we need to be doing in the future. So this chart is if you like, it's a unofficial guide to some Scouting themes or themes that have impacted Scouting in the past, and it's also a little bit of an unofficial guide around some of the bigger Scouting themes that we're concentrating on right now. So we've talked about things like globalization. We've talked a little bit about the world of technology. We touched on just a minute ago volunteerism, which we're going to talk more about over the next couple of slides, and dual income benefits. But it's probably worthwhile sharing the role of competition, both in terms of the choice parents have to be able to put their kids into different programs. I mean, we literally live in a very and highly competitive world right now. It's not unusual for parents to choose to put their youth in a sports-related activity, a dance-related activity, or a craft or art or music or language-related activity, as well as then thinking, okay, what other days have I got left and how do I create that kind of well-rounded development experience for our youth? And so they're making these decisions, which certainly there wasn't that same level of choice, certainly back in the 1960s. The other big things that we will be talking upon, particularly as we look into the future, is multiculturalism, diversity and inclusion, and how that actually plays. But I think, you know, it's no surprise to anybody thinking about, 1940s, 50s, 60s and 70s, that equal rights movement was just developing at that time. I mean, equal rights were not really known back in the 1940s and 50s. And even through 60s and 70s, it was changing, very, very dynamic. Now we live in a world where, fortunately, we've progressed significantly, and we can be very proud that our country is really very much at the world center of multiculturalism, both in terms of diversity but also in terms of inclusion. So let's think about what that means for Scouting, how we make that relevant, and how we bring that in. And then finally on youth development, there has been a shift. Probably really turning point was 1970s, 80s, but moving from what we might describe as adult-centric learning and teaching into more youth development, youth involvement, youth engagement, and certainly the Canadian Path personifies that, which is why we had to change our program from a 1960s program to a more relevant and dynamic modern program we see today. Let me give you a little bit more information though on sport, which is often one of the key things that we're seen to be competitors of. The reality is they're having exactly the same challenge that we're facing. Canadians are shifting from participant to spectator across all sports across the country. This is recognized, whether it be hockey, whether it be swimming, whether it be football, soccer or otherwise. So Vital Signs and True Sport got together, and so again there's a couple of reports out there for those that are interested, and they wanted to dig into what's causing that movement, because of course it does have bottom line impacts on Canadian economy and also people themselves. The key things that they were getting out of it were lack of enjoyment, a move away from sports because of difficulty of time, the investment that's actually required, both in times of cost, but also how to actually create that space with balancing it with work. Widening gender gap, which is a bit surprising because they've made a lot of work to actually narrow that gender gap between male and female. I've actually seen that widen over the last 10 years. And again, cost has become a barrier for many. The fun has gone out of sport. I mean, so you can see in that statistic of 73%, where people are fundamentally saying that it's become too competitive and focused on winning, and so the fun has been left out of sports. And I think many of us with kids actually experience that on a regular basis. So what are they doing about it, and what can we learn from the strategies that they're taking? So these are just 8 of their strategic themes that Sports Canada is looking at, and is captured in this Vital Signs report. And they're looking to how do they strengthen belonging to each other and the communities. So they're looking at things like dedicated strategies on teen girls, at-risk youth, diversity inclusion plays, where they're having dedicated strategies for LGBTQ. They're having dedicated strategies for mental and physical disabilities. Looking to how are they actively recruiting and involving newcomers into Canada. As well, low-income families, and of course, being sports, they have the entire spectrum from infants to seniors. So how are they actually meeting that market and looking at that segmentation? So I think there's several things that we can take from this in terms of how are we also segmenting our strategies, and do we need to be doing things differently across the country? Should the Canadian path perhaps be modified with relevancy depending on who we're trying to reach and how we reach them in a more effective manner? So changing gears, I want to talk a little bit about volunteerism. So boomers and millennials, and thinking about what that means for us in terms of Scouts Canada. So back in the 1960s, there was an enormous amount more time available for people to be able to volunteer. The proliferation of dual income families was not the same as it is today, and actually the economic pressures weren't to the same extent as they are experiencing today. With other natural barriers around travel and connectivity and local community, it all actually favoured people wanting to be part of that local community spirit. So what we've got coming is a couple of new key things which we have to adapt to. Firstly, the boomers that had their children and then their grandchildren in scouting are now at retirement age. So they are a highly educated, mobile, global group of folk that we have to think about. How do we bring them into Scouts Canada? How do they see value in giving their time, skills and expertise back to support our youth programs? And the way that we used to bring people in for dedicated roles, year-round commitment, is just not relevant. Boomers are not looking for that. They're looking for part-time commitments. They're looking for micro-volunteering or project-based volunteering. To a certain extent, they're looking for virtual volunteering. So you don't actually have to physically be where you're needing to volunteer. You can be at a distance position away. The other things that we want to think about is millennials. Millennials are now coming to the age at which they have children who can come into colonies and packs. So they're both parents and they're also our potential volunteers. And they also are wanting to see different things if they're going to dedicate their time. The big messaging that coming up in volunteerism nowadays is about mission impact. How do you align purpose and profit? So there's a few books there if everybody's interested in learning more about this. But they all speak to this purpose and profit, this mission impact, and how we have to think about our volunteer model, and how we have to think about alternative volunteer approaches as we consider the next wave of volunteers coming into our organisation. So we're going to go into the future now and look at the evolving trends in Canada and then more broadly. And again, I've taken the liberty of capturing the 6 focus areas that we need to be thinking about in the future. And this is not a definitive list, but this kind of enables us to give some consideration to the things like the Sports Canada insights, what's happened when we reflect back on learning over the last 100 years. So we've talked about volunteerism. I'm going to share a little bit more with you about growth and market share. We touched on multiculturalism and diversity, but we're going to spend a few extra seconds there. Then I'm going to talk about something new, which is environmental leadership, and then finally wrap it up with a Canadian path. So let's look at market share. So this chart should be very familiar to most people, relating back to our mission to develop well-rounded youth better prepared for success in the world. But what does that mean? You know, we've done a little bit on this before, but the bottom line is this, and it's expressed in this simple calculation, which is if you have something that we know lots of youth have the capability of benefiting from, and by benefiting from that, they have the ability to be better parents, better families, better community, better society, better world, then why would we not be wanting to give as many people as possible access to that skill set? i.e., we need lots of members. We've got to create this opportunity for people. We can't have people missing out on this opportunity. So second to that is great program. A, they're not going to come, and B, they're definitely not going to stay if the program isn't great and it isn't delivered by great people, great scouters who see program quality and mission impact every single day. So the combination of the two, lots of members who need to know about it, we need to make sure it's relevant, and we need to make sure it's dynamic, and also it's delivered in a fantastic way, will yield this end mission impact outcome, a better world, better society, better community. So market share, let's give you a little bit of data. So this is a graph of percentage market share against target population. The bottom line is this: we only reach 1.4% of our market share against our target age population in Canada. It varies slightly, as you can see, by province and therefore by council, but the reality is maximum of anywhere we are in the country is 2%. So I think all of us would say that, you know, 2%, any way we look at it, is not unrealistic. We wouldn't be being greedy, we wouldn't be going after something extreme. At 2%, we're probably not competing with anybody. The reality is 2% should be extremely achievable. 2%, which you can see from the yellow bars topping up the dark brown red bars, that would give us an additional 35,000 youth just to get to 2% market share. That would swell our membership to 100,000 youth across the country. So it's achievable. We've just got to think about what are those ingredients that enables that to actually be delivered. Okay, so let's get into diversity, and here in particular we're wanting to be looking at new markets and put up their representative. So for me, when I stand back and I think about success in diversity, in inclusion, in representation across Canada, I mean, I really look to the opportunity of, you know, we've got so many new Canadians coming into Canada, myself included, that, you know, what if in 10 years' time we were able to be standing here and saying every group that we look at, every council we look at across the country, we're actually seeing is a reflection of that total geography, of that total membership, of that total population of Canada. And I think that for me is a really exciting opportunity. And I do think that given the program and the offering that we've got, I think it is, you know, Scouts Canada is in the perfect position to be able to offer that, if only people knew what we had to offer, and if only they saw it as being relevant, and if only we actually created that diverse and inclusive nature to who we are and how we actually want members to come in and join us, both youth and also volunteers. So Canada is one of the most multicultural countries in the world. I thought this particular statistic, well, actually surprised me, but then really resonated with me. 85% of the 250,000 permanent residents which call Canada home each year, 85% of them also go on to getting naturalization, i.e. they become Canadian, which is the highest in the world, which I think is something we can be very proud of, but it's equally a huge opportunity for Scouts Canada. So we're all, I believe, very familiar with the statistics that we have around how indeed Canada is inviting more and more diverse people in every single year. As you can see here, you know, when we look out probably another 20, 30 years, roughly 30 to 40% of our entire population is going to have been born in a country other than Canada. So there's a huge opportunity if we can plug into those markets, be relevant to those different communities, and have things that they see as beneficial for them coming in and integrating into Canada and Canadian values, which is why, of course, they came here in the first place. Very exciting, very. Okay, let's look a little bit more at inclusion. And so often with inclusion, often we jump to the LGBTQ2 plus and the entire spectrum of gender diversity. But of course there's far more diversity in inclusion, and that can include education, that can include religion, that can include the autism spectrum, mental health, physical health, etc. So again, we pride ourselves in Scouts Canada and Scouts more generally as being an organisation which is highly inclusive, highly diverse. But the reality is we can do better here. There are many people out there that really want to learn more. It's something that I personally need to learn more. I mean, I struggle with in my own venture company. I have examples of youth who are asking questions around their gender, wanting to be referred to as them and they. And I've got to be honest with you, for me personally, it's something that I struggle with because it's not the way I was brought up. So I struggle with it in the context of how can I support this youth? I mean, to put myself in their shoes in terms of what they are going through and some of the challenges of their, they are wondering which gender do they actually belong to. How do I help them through that journey? We are trusted adults. We're often some of the first people youth will come to for advice and for counselling and for guidance, and we're not necessarily the best equipped at all of the time. So we've got to understand, when do we need to go and get better educated? When do we need support to be helping the youth that we represent? And I certainly want to try to be supportive and be more supportive of a lot more of the inclusion and diversity issues that are expanding. And as it says here, youth are the most diverse than they've ever been before. So we have to think about how we support them. Looking again, differentiations are slightly different from diversity. And so this is the first time where I'm actually tackling environmental stewardship specifically. One of the things which has been core to Scouts since it began with Baden-Powell, 115, 20 years ago now, is we have always embraced the outdoors as an environment for non-formal education, as an environment for learning. We've always embraced the outdoors and environmental stewardship indirectly, if not directly. And we've always looked at conservation. So it's becoming more and more important for quite a large number of people in society. Personally, I'm very committed to the environment and have a background in looking at environment and sustainable development. So, that creates a good segue, and the partnership that we're seeing with WUSIM, the World Organization Scouting Movement, is they've partnered with the United Nations and their Sustainable Development Goals in something called Scouts for SDGs, where they're looking at the themes that you can see here, which is basically segmentation and different ways in which Scouts and youth and groups across the world and hopefully within Canada can be thinking about how can we doing things which are tied to the movement of sustainable development, the considerations around where is climate change going, where is environmental stewardship going. So this is something for me that I think Scouts has a true capability to be able to differentiate from our competitors who are not as adept and certainly are not as well known for having environmental stewardship and environmental leadership integrated within their program. So watch this space. It's something we can do a lot more on. So moving to the last couple of categories. So firstly, alternative volunteerism, which we've touched on, and we have a nice graphic there of millennials and boomers. But the bottom line here that I really want us to be, thinking about and doing better in is how do we make it easier and more fun for both youth but also future volunteers in the future? How do we make them want to be part of our future movement? So the sorts of things that we need to do better in is really understanding orientation. We need to be understanding our linkage and measurement back to mission impact. As I mentioned earlier, volunteerism has moved into a world where people want to be able to know how they're actually impacting on a day-to-day basis. The same can be said in our donor space and philanthropy more generally. The other thing that we need to be balancing is volunteer screening. We are very passionate within Scouts Canada to be a leading organisation in how we represent safety with youth, how we're providing education, but how we're also screening our individuals. So we're doing the best job we possibly can to make sure that the right people are joining Scouting and we're keeping the wrong people out. So we want to be thinking about how do we still make that easy, but at the same time create the right safeguards and become that true, if you like, industry leader in the world of not-for-profit and volunteerism and youth organizations. So outdoors is another big theme that we will need to be thinking about. You know, as we move from rural areas into more and more technology-enabled metropolitan centres, and as we know, most of the population in Canada lives within about 100 kilometres from the US border. What are we doing with respect to outdoor skills which are not so prevalent, particularly in the new wave of volunteers that are coming into our organisation? So how are we maintaining our roots with outdoor skills? How are we maintaining our roots in of adventure and enabling Scouters to be able to have that confidence and competence to be able to get outside, practice what we need the youth to be understanding to be able to deliver our Canadian Path programme? So let's finish on Canadian Path. And let's finish on youth empowerment. It's probably the main thing that Scouts is known for. It's certainly what we would consider to be one of our key differentiators, what makes us different from everybody else, or certainly makes us stand out from others. We have implemented within our governance structures, or whether it be members of the Board of Governors or Directors, whether it be senior positions at councils and all the way down to group and also section level, youth are included and are partners and equals of adults. It's within our program, the Canadian Path, at all levels. We want to have youth leadership. And then we touched on the education side a little bit earlier, but SPICES is our non-formal educational framework. And what we know is if we're implementing the full system of SPICES in a deliberate manner, if we're implementing progressive adventure and progressive youth development in a systematic manner, fundamentally, if we're delivering Canadian Path in a systematic manner, we're going to create positive life development attributes for youth that will truly make the world a better place. And that's what it's all about. So the key takeaway from this final slide from me is really about what's your role in whatever you are, a volunteer or a staff member, thinking about how am I implementing the Canadian Path, how am I supporting One Scouts, and how we're using the total resource pool of Scouts Canada across the country, and how we're enabling positive youth development through the implementation of SPICES, adventure, outdoor activity skills. So bringing it all together, hopefully you got a bit of a flavour of some of the key themes of what we need to be thinking about as we go forward into the future. Hopefully have a bit more insight into what got us here in the first place and what some of those trends that have caused us to grow and then to go into decline and now hopefully to grow again. And hopefully it's given you a little bit of a perspective of what can you do at a council, national or indeed local level to understand where we need to go into the future. So a little bit of a taster. So thank you very much for everything you do in Scouting.